All right.
Yeah. I don't think anyone is in yet. Hi, welcome. If you are just joining us, welcome to tonight's event for When the Angels Left the Old Country. We would love to know where you're joining us from and have a chance to say hello. Thanks for being here tonight. Thank you again for being here. We're going to just leave a minute or two for everyone to join us. And we will get started in just a couple minutes. And again, feel free to let us know where you're attending from tonight. Hi, welcome. If you are just joining us, thank you for being here this evening. We're excited to talk about When the Angels Left the Old Country. Feel free to put in the chat where you're joining us from, say hello. I think I see a couple of people in the chat that we both know, which is exciting. Thanks for being here. And we'll probably give it about one more minute before we get started. We have Emily from Philadelphia. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Emily.
Hi, if you're just joining us, welcome. We're so glad you're here. Feel free to say where you're joining us from in the chat, and we'll get started in just a second. And it is 7:34, so I think we can probably go ahead and get started. And we'll go from there. If you're just joining us, thank you so much for being here. Feel free to put where you're coming from in the chat so we can say hello. And welcome to everyone who's here for tonight's event discussing When the Angels Left the Old Country by Sacha with East City Bookshop. I'm Ariane, the store manager, and I am so excited to be speaking with Sacha tonight about their book. East City Bookshop is an independent, community-minded, and woman-owned bookstore on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And though Sacha is not in DC, we're so pleased to be able to gather virtually this evening. Before we dive in, I have just a few housekeeping notes. If you need any tech assistance, my colleague Emma is going to be keeping an eye on the Zoom chat, so you can ask for any help there. We'll also have time for a Q&A towards the end of the program this evening. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to put a question or more than one in the Q&A box. The earlier, the better. And of course, if you still need to purchase a copy of When the Angels Left the Old Country for yourself, or maybe some extra copies for holiday gifts, you can order from us at eastcitybookshop.com and we ship. Now, I am so pleased to introduce tonight's author, Sacha, who is a 2018 Lambda Literary Fellow in Young Adult Fiction and graduated in Library and Information Science and History from Simmons University. Sacha lives in New England with a miniature dachshund mix named Ansu Bean, and When the Angels Left the Old Country is their debut novel. Full disclosure, we do know each other, and I'm just delighted to be able to talk with a friend about a book that I loved so much. When the Angels Left the Old Country is a queer historical fantasy about an angel and a demon who have been centuries-long study partners and travel to America in search of a missing girl from their shtetl. On the way, they find more dangers than they bargained for, and I will let Sacha tell you more. And a big thank you to Sacha and everyone in the audience for being here tonight. So to hand things over, Sacha, thanks again for being here. Do you want to tell everyone a little about yourself and the book?
Sure. Yeah, I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me. When the Angels Left the Old Country is a book that I've been describing as an Ellis Island era immigrant fairy tale. It is about labor unions and immigration laws and ghosts and magic and murders. And it was really, really fun to write. And I've been just blown away to the response to it since it's come out. So it's been a really exciting debut season for me.
It's been just so wonderful to see. I think I've seen a lot about this book on lists around the internet and getting great reviews from other booksellers. And I think it just deserves every iota of praise that it's gotten. And it's been, I think, wonderful, having heard about it before it was written, before it was agented. It's just great to see it now out in the world for everyone to see. One thing that grabbed me right away about the book was the writing style and the narrative voice. And that's just really one of my favorite things about the book that really made it stand out to me this year. Do you want to read a little bit to give us a sample of the voice?
Yes, I will just be reading the first couple of pages here. So it's the introduction to two of the three main characters and to the narrator too, who has their own voice. In the back corner of the little synagogue in the shtetl that was so small and out of the way, it was only called shtetl. There was a table where an angel and a demon had been studying Talmud together for some 200 years. Indeed, they had been studying in that corner since before the little shul was built, and had been rather startled to look up one day and realize an entire building had sprung up around them. Because the corner they had claimed for their own was close to the door and far from the stove, no one had ever felt it necessary to question their presence. They were always there. There was no reason to assume they would ever not be there. They showed up to study and sometimes could be seen davening in the back of the shul at Minyan too, but never when there were fewer than 10 men in the room. One of them never wore a tallis, and the other wore a tallis even during the night, folded over his back like a pair of delicate wings. The demon's name was Ashmedai. He was not the demon king Ashmedai you may have heard of, but one of that Ashmedai's children. The demon king enjoyed an overgenerous measure of self-regard and had named a great number of his children after himself. Perhaps he intended to stymie the angel of death. Perhaps he had trouble thinking of another name. In any case, our Ashmedai was a very minor prince of demons, belonging to that class of creatures another people might call fairies, and we Jews know as shadim, mischievous spirits of the earth who enjoy leading people astray. Most of those who knew him did not call him by his full name, but shrank it to fit his stature and called him Little Ash. Little Ash knew hardly any magic and did not even have the wings with which most adult demons fly from place to place. He had made trouble in the demons' yeshiva where they learned their magic, and without completing his studies, he had been sent to Poland, where he found he liked it better than at home, where as in his father's palace, other demons were always treating him like a child and telling him what to do. The angel had been sent to shtetl for a purpose it had now forgotten, and it had stayed in shtetl to hinder the mischievous whims of Little Ash. Like Little Ash, it resembled a human youth. Unlike Little Ash, who considered himself to be male, The angel had merely chosen the shape of a man for convenience, as angels have done since the time of Abraham our father. It had never had a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah or any such ceremony at all, and had never bothered to wish for one. Its name, of course, changed according to the activity in which it was engaged. At the moment, the angel's name was Argument. And you will have to read the book to find out what they're arguing about. They have many arguments.
Classic.
But I really wanted the narrator to have sort of a classic literature kind of voice, like the sort of voice that the narrator would have in something that was written in the late 19th century or in the 20th century, so that when you pick it up and read it, it should feel almost familiar, like a classic. And Arthur Levine, the editor, really understood that from the start. That was one of the things that made me think that I made the right choice accepting his offer on the book, because the first email he sent to me, he was like, I want this to look like a classic. I want it to be like a nice hardcover object. And all of his edits were toward really strengthening that aspect of the book. And I'm really, really pleased with how it's come out and with the response that it's gotten.
If you haven't seen the cover, it's very beautiful. It's a beautiful book object. And I really love I think it has that kind of classic feel to me. And I love the familiarity of like of course, as you know, like that does such a good job of, I don't know, just throwing the reader right in, even if you as the reader don't know like what a talit is or what shading are. That's another thing that really struck me, how just immersed you are immediately kind of in the world.
I wanted it to be very sort of straightforward and to kind of give the reader the impression that the narrator expects you to understand and expects you to come along, which I think sometimes when you over-explain, it can have a distancing effect because it makes the reader almost feel like you don't fully trust them to keep up. And as a reader myself, I really like to be invited into the world and to be sort of accepted in that way. And those little asides, the like, of course, and we do it this way, those things I really like as invitations to be like, come into my little circle and listen to my story. And, you know, you don't have to actually know what they're saying, but you have that sense of familiarity and comfort. And it, I think it lowers the barrier in some ways to a lot of the culturally specific details, because there's that historic feeling. It's like no matter what culture a book is set in, if it's 100-year-old book, you're going to have that distance. So constructing it on purpose was a way of making people go into it realizing from the very first sentences and the very first paragraph that there are going to be a lot of these culturally specific details, but also the narrator is going to just bring you along.
I love that. And I love how much of that you just, see right in those first couple pages. And this, of course, is also a blend of historical fiction and like fantasy and magic. What made you interested in blending the two?
Those are the two genres that I really liked the most, especially when I was a kid. I read probably all of the Dear America diaries that were fictional diaries of kids from different periods of American history. And a lot of them had all these like really morbid and gory details in them that really stuck in your head. And one of them was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire American Dear Diary thing. And there were such horrifying details in it. but they really got me interested at a young age in history. And the other genre that I really like was fantasy and fairy tales. And I read a lot of Tamora Pierce, and then a little later, Holly Black, and all of those authors started writing about fairies. And I really loved those two genres separately, but until recently, there wasn't a lot of historical fantasy fairy tale all together, all the genres that I love in one piece. And so this book was very much bringing together all of the things that I love in one big soup pot and mixing them all together. And it started actually as a sort of decompression project after I finished another manuscript that was very difficult, and I was on a deadline for that because the leader of my Lambda workshop had given us all a year to return a draft to her and she would critique it. So I tried very hard, and it was a very difficult book to write. And I got to the end and I handed it in to her, and I thought, I want to do something easy and fun and comfortable. So I went back to my comfort zone. I went to the folk tales and I went to the history. And this book, the first draft of this book, took like 6 weeks to write. And then it took much, much longer than that to edit into the final form. But it was really just about putting everything that I love together in one thing and blending it. And I think it also, there's a sort of a natural way of bringing fairy tales together with historical stories like this, because in a lot of people's lives, even as the modern era was beginning, fairy tales were sort of fact. It's just like, you know, in the woods, there's the Baba Yaga, and that's just a fact, and you stay out of the woods. And even as you're moving into a modern society, people still have those fears and those traditional beliefs. And I thought it was fun to just bring them into the modern society and have them personified in the characters of Little Ash and the Angel, who are encountering modern society and they're not entirely comfortable with it too.
It reminds me of books where like the train is coming to the society and everyone is freaking out about the train, but like we know the train is coming.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I like keeping the fairy aspect or the folklore aspect along with that.
Yeah, and one of the books that I really love that also does this is The Golem and the Jinni, which
Mhm.
the sequel to that, I haven't read it yet, but it came out recently and I have a copy of it that I am going to read soon when I'm on vacation. So I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, that came up a lot in my mind as a comp to this book, with the immigration and the Jewish folklore and other folklore, and it's I think a similar era in time.
Mhm.
I think I hear also like good omens with like the demon and the angel friendship, um,
Mhm.
and lots of other things. Actually, I feel like there's a lot that is kind of related, which is nice. Um, and you of course are a librarian, an archivist, and historian. So how did that influence your writing process or your process of thinking about the story?
I think one thing that it did was it definitely sped up the drafting process,
Mm.
because I kind of got a lot of the historical research almost as a freebie alongside writing my master's thesis in history, because I finished my master's in history, I think earlier in the year that I wrote the book. And my thesis is about Cecilia Rozovsky, who was the director of the National Council for Jewish Women's Immigrant Aid Wing in the 1920s. And so she was in charge of Jewish women's immigrant aid after the quota system was established. But of course, to get the context for all of that, and like when was the NCJW founded, and how did immigration laws develop over time? How did they get to the point of the quota laws? I read, starting in 1880, everything. And I did a ton of research. And so I had already had all of that in my head and had already thought about it a lot and processed it a lot for the actual academic history research. So it was like for free. Now I've done all the research to write a novel about immigration. And the other half of it, the folklore half, was like what I was reading for fun while I was doing all of that serious research. So it definitely sped up the process. It wasn't like I started with the idea for the story and then had to do research. And I kind of like that. It's a little unfortunate that I'm now going to have to do research for other ideas that where I had the idea first, but it's also really nice to sort of have another use for something that I put so much work into and that I'm so passionate about.
That's so wonderful. Yeah, once you said it sped up the process, I was like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine how much time that would save to just have all of that in your lap. That's amazing. For, I guess there's other aspects of the history. Something else that the book does so well is talk about like modern social issues and not modern identities, but like identities that we think of in a certain way that are present in this book. Do you want to say a little bit about how that worked as well?
Yeah, so it was important to me to include a lot of queer characters. It's almost the whole universe is a little bit centered around queer characters. And part of that was that the idea that I had for the Talmud study partnership relationship, I have been thinking for a while about that type of relationship as quasi-romantic or homoerotic relationship. There's even in the Talmud itself, the very famous study partners, Rabbi Yochanan and Resh Lakish, there are hundreds and hundreds of citations to their arguments over laws in the Talmud. And the story of their lives is that Rabbi Yochanan was the hottest rabbi ever, and he was a great scholar. And one day the bandit Resh Lakish saw Rabbi Yochanan bathing in the river, and he like leaps into the river because he thinks he's a beautiful woman, and he's like, "What's up?" And Rabbi Yochanan is like, "I'm a man, but my sister is as hot as I am. And if you married my sister, you could come and study Torah with me for the rest of our lives." And they do. And finally, after Resh Lakish dies of old age, Rabbi Yochanan is heartbroken, and he's telling his disciples, "None of you can argue with me the way that he argued with me for all of these years." And so it's quite easy to read this as a romantic or a homoerotic story. And it's also one of the foremost relationships in the Talmud. Like, they're on so many pages of the book with their legal arguments. So the idea of the Talmud study partnership as a queer relationship was in my head. And that was kind of what set me off, was thinking, what if I did that, but I made it an angel and a demon, to bring that supernatural opposites into this relationship that's built on argument and constructive disagreement. And so I started with that central relationship at the heart of the story. And then I wanted them to also be encountering queer human characters, because I didn't want it to be just that things are different for supernatural characters, and you can be queer because you're supernatural or something, and then humans can't. And so I did also read a lot about the very scarce but existing historical records that we have of queer people living around the time that the book is set. And a couple of the great sources that I have, A Rainbow Thread, edited by Noam Sienna, is an amazing anthology of sources on queerness throughout Jewish history, going back all the way to the 1st century of the Common Era. And there's a couple of stories in there that are around my time period. There was one case that was someone who worked in garment factories and died of tuberculosis, probably exacerbated by the working conditions, who upon their death was discovered to have really been a woman despite living as a man, and had been living as the husband to another garment worker. And so we have this story. It was a Jewish trans man or lesbian or whatever. And there also is at least one story of someone successfully getting through Ellis Island as a man who was later again discovered, quote unquote, really to have been a woman, but had made it through immigration under the male identity. So these stories are out there, and there are very, very few of them. But I think the fact that any exist at all suggests that there's sort of a bigger universe of stories out there that weren't discovered, because a lot of the cases where we have a historical record of someone living a queer life, it's because they died and their trans identity was discovered, or they were arrested and that got written down. But a lot of people's lives just don't make it into the historical record. So I took sort of the very few sources that we do have and imagined and extrapolated out from them, thinking there would be so many other lives that just didn't get written about, or people didn't admit things that were illegal to admit and things like this. And the human protagonist, Rose, the young girl character in the book, is partly inspired by a real life lesbian Jewish garment unionist, Rose Schneiderman, who was very, very prominent in the early creation of women's garment unions. And there are stories of, like, you'd go to the union meeting and this teeny tiny little redhead would be standing on a box and she would give the most impassioned speech that people had ever heard. And so I gave Rose's name in tribute to Rose Schneiderman, the real life lesbian garment worker.
That is so great to know, like those nuggets in the historical record. And I love the way that you put them in the story. Like at the beginning, when Rose she finds out that her best friend is getting married and has a fairly extreme like emotional response to that. And I think that just rings so true for somebody who may not have heard of like queer identities, but like that rings very true for what that person would be feeling. That just really stuck out to me.
Yeah, I gave Rose sort of a quintessential moment that I think is in some ways very timeless, where you realize that your best friend has been approaching best friendship in a way that doesn't match up with the way that you've been approaching it. And she feels betrayed, and she feels like she can't be happy for her friend, and she knows she should be, and so she's angry about it, and she has all these twisted up emotions. And by the end of the book, she gets to take them out on fighting some injustice. So
as should we all.
yes.
And I also was really interested in a side character who shows up just for a chapter, named Yassel, who there's some allusions to, his name changing for his own reasons and things like that. And so I was curious to hear more about that character and where anything else that you know about him.
Yeah, so he was originally a larger piece of that early section of the novel. He was originally the one who gave Little Ash and Oriel their identity papers. And he is a trans man, and he lives with a couple of women, and they have some children that they're raising together. And he ended up having his whole section had to be taken out just for narrative momentum. But he's also based on a true story that we have in the newspaper records, albeit from like a decade later, and this is in 2 books. It's in A Rainbow Thread that I mentioned before, and it's also in Bad Rabbi by Eddie Portnoy. It's a little tiny clipping from one of the Yiddish papers in Warsaw in the 20s, where they found this ring of identity document forgers who were, one, making documents for Jews who didn't have travel permits because travel was very restricted for Jews at the time in that area. And the other thing they were doing was they were making new identity documents for men who were having sex with other men and didn't want it to get back to their families. So they were living under new identities that this ring of forgers created for them in order to keep their 2 different lives separate. And of course, we know this, as in the case of many queer incidents from history, because the forgers were eventually arrested. But I loved the idea of that. And that's where the seed of the character of Yosel, who unfortunately didn't make it all the way into the finished novel, came from. But this intertwining of queer life and migrant life is very much still part of the book.
Yeah, he really like caught my eye because I don't know, it just seemed like there was a lot more there for him. So I'm excited that I got a chance to ask you about him.
Yes, thank you, because I love talking about that little story there.
I'm so glad. Let's see. Something else I'm just kind of interested in is, I think that like one thing that's so wonderful about this book is all the different kinds of representation, and that's a lot of what we've been talking about. But I think like there are also, I've seen conversations about like the limits of like marketing a book purely based on representation. So I guess I'm curious, like what other things you really hope readers find in the book and get out of it, or what else you would like be really excited to draw people to it.
I would love for people to get more interested in the historical aspects too, in the labor unions and workers' rights and all of those things from the second half of the novel, from the parts where they're in America. And of course, learning more about immigration restriction and thinking about why we shouldn't be detaining people and letting them just sit in jam-packed detention centers and catch infectious diseases and be separated from their families. All of this is very important. Also, something that I thought consciously about while I was writing it is the fact that Eastern Europe was also modernizing at this time. We have this sort of fairy tale version of the immigration story that almost casts the country of origin as belonging to the past and not changing and growing in the way that America does. And I wanted to have the book show a little more dimension there, and that everywhere is complicated and everywhere is changing. And obviously, if people are leaving for another country, that's also a change for the people who are staying. And so I want to explore this further in other projects, but just the idea that like, just because all of us who are here in America are here because we're not in somewhere that our ancestors left, unless our ancestors are Native American, then it doesn't mean that the places that ancestors left don't also change and didn't also have lots of things going on, and people who were at different levels of religious observance, and people who also, they were having labor unions were starting up in Eastern Europe and everything. So I really wanted to have that sense of the depth of history and not have everything be flattened out the way that it sometimes does in collective memory. I hope that comes across in the book without being too didactic, but it was something that was important.
Yeah, I think the book to me does a great job of showing a real, yeah, a real variety of experiences and not specifically not being didactic. I really love that. Um, and then of course the next question I had in mind was about kind of the, I don't know, I feel like one of the major themes of the book is kind of a sense of like obligation to,
Mhm.
there's a lot of competing senses of obligation between different characters based on their morals and values and the people that are important to them. Um, and so I'm curious about, yeah, your thoughts on like obligation as a theme in the book, or any other themes or kind of morals that really felt wrapped up in it for you.
Yeah, obligation is a really interesting one. And I think I definitely thought about it consciously a lot with the character of the angel, because in a way, at the beginning, it's entirely defined by its obligations, or it feels that it is, because of the folklore of angels that I based the character in, where there's this idea in Jewish folklore that angels only have one task at a time. And if they switch tasks, it's like their whole identity changes. And that's the idea behind the angel's name changing according to what it's doing. But in order to create an identity as an individual person and retain parts of itself that are important to it while it evolves, the angel has to wrestle with the idea of having obligations to itself as well as to the universe. Like, maybe it's all right also to turn away from what feels like an obligation and say, actually, something is more important to me than that. And there's also Little Ash's kind of opposite conflict, is feeling that people don't expect him to be obligated by the rules of community. He's a demon. People kind of expect him to be harmful and be a disruptive influence, but he feels himself to very much to be part of the Jewish community. He feels that demons like himself have a long history in the Jewish community. There's one scene where he cites a couple of demons who are in the Talmud hanging out with the rabbis, and that's a cool thing. That's a little bit weird. But so there's these two opposing questions that those two characters are dealing with. Is like, when your community expects a lot of you, how do you push back against that sense of obligation in order to hold on to what's most important to you as an individual? And then when your community doesn't expect a lot of you, and when your community sort of pushes you to the edges, how do you assert yourself and say, actually, I am part of this community. I am bound by the rules of this community. I care about this community. So that's very much something that is right at the heart of those characters. And I think obligations to community are a big theme and a big part of the whole narrative, especially when it comes to the missions that the characters are on as they go through their story. There's there's uh obligations to the dead, and obligations to family, and obligations to yourself, and it's really a very important central theme. So yeah,
That's so great to hear a little more about. Yeah, that really stuck out to me as very central and very yeah, the times when obligations come into conflict and
mhm.
that being very difficult sometimes.
Yeah, it was one of the fun ways of sort of bringing the religious structure of the story that is kind of inherent to having characters that are supernatural and built off of Talmudic folklore, a way to bring that into the narrative and to fuel the narrative through the structures that are kind of inherent in the character concepts. It was really fun.
Awesome. Well, I think now is probably a great time to do some question and answer from the audience. We have a few questions in the Q&A box, but if anybody else has any, please feel free to just enter them in, and we should have time to get through several. So to start off with, we have one question. How did you decide to write this as YA instead of adult fantasy?
Part of it is that I read more YA, so I am naturally geared toward thinking of my work as YA. I did have my agent, when we were doing developmental edits on it, she said that it's really borderline, like it could have gone adult or YA. And the reason we ended up going to YA agents, editors with it first, was actually very practical and not really that much to do with this individual book. It was that my other projects are more definitively YA. And then we got an Arthur Levine preempt. So Arthur Levine is very, very, very well regarded, and Levine Querido is an amazing publisher. They're only 3 years old. They've won so many awards, and it's really was an amazing opportunity to actually work with Arthur Levine, and Maddie, who was his assistant editor at the time, who also worked on it, was also amazing. And I think that their reputation and their passion for the books that they put out have really helped this book, because with a bigger publisher, I could see a book like this sort of falling through the cracks or being pushed off into sort of a niche. But because everyone at LQ believes so hard in every single book on their list, and everyone works so hard for every book on their list, the reach of this book feels like it's going much farther than it had the potential to do. So it was kind of not that much about the book itself. It was more about circumstances that have to do with the publishing industry. But yeah, I definitely think it has crossover appeal, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, I think also, like you mentioned, like the Golem and the Genie being a good comparison, that's adult. I think that would be, I think someone who would enjoy that book would enjoy this book, absolutely. And I'm excited to hear about more projects. That's always good news. Let's see. You've talked, I think maybe a little, or maybe I've read your other interviews and we've talked, but what would you consider some of your inspirations for this book that maybe haven't come up yet?
I am really inspired by sort of classics in Yiddish literature. Isaac Bashevis Singer is great. He also does some supernatural stuff. One of the stories that is kind of baked into the DNA of this one is his short story, The Last Demon, which is from the perspective of a demon who lives in the attic of a synagogue. And he, in this story, is just narrating this reminiscence of the times when he used to torment the wonder-working rabbi, and now everyone is gone, and he's just up in this attic alone, eating the Hebrew letters out of books. And that story is really great. Sholem Aleichem, I really enjoy. Mendele the Bookseller. And there's also been recently some awesome Jewish fantasy coming out, both in YA and adult, and even in middle grade. Aidan Polydorus, The City Beautiful, I love that book. Rebecca Podes's From Dust to Flame is really great and has a much meaner shade in it, and a shade who's a lot worse than Little Ash. Rena Roster and Ava Reed both have adult Jewish fantasy out. So we're in a moment now when this genre feels really strong, and that's really exciting.
That's really great. Yeah. A side note, when you mentioned the demon eating the letters out of the books, there's some details in your book about little Ash being able to see like sins written across people in letters. Is that drawn from that story, or does that come from something else?
That was just sort of out of my own head. The idea of having them be constructed out of Hebrew letters comes from the idea that the whole world is written in Hebrew letters, and it's kind of a mystical concept that I put together with. I wanted there to be some way for him to know certain things about people, and I wanted to have there be kind of a vivid tactile detail and not be just like, oh, he's just sort of vaguely reading people's minds.
That was a neat, yeah, very neat, like visual image. That also really stuck with me. Um, Somebody else asks, which is better, Rosh Hashanah or Purim?
I'm a high holy days person. I really like the high holy days. I like the shofar. I like the autumn weather. I do not like sitting in a really uncomfortable folding chair for many hours at a time. But yeah, I love the high holy days, and I can't drink, which makes Purim a little less fun as an adult. But it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah.
All holidays are good holidays.
It's in the name. It's in
Yes.
Let's see if anyone else has more questions. We do definitely have time for some more. We have another one in, if your book was made into a movie and you could have an author cameo, what scene would you want to be in?
Oh, that's a fun question. I feel like I would not want to be in steerage, because it would probably be kind of gross. You'd have to be dressed up all to look all miserable, and everything would be dirty, and it would be dark in there probably. I'm sure it wouldn't be as dark in a movie as it was in real life, because they have to light the actors and everything. But that one doesn't sound so fun. Maybe at the strike meeting, that could be fun, because you'd get to, as an extra in a strike meeting scene, you'd probably get to like yell a bunch and be really passionate and listen to some passionate speeches and pretend that you were rabble rousing. That would be fun.
That sounds really fun. Yes. Somewhere you can make some noise.
Yes.
We also have, what song or songs would make a good soundtrack for this book?
I don't listen to a ton of music. The one song that's actually in the book is, there's a line from Lecha Dodi in there that little Ash sort of sings to the angel as a joke. But I think it would be good with a klezmer soundtrack. You could get some Daniel Kahn in there. That would be really good. Modern klezmer style. Yeah. Some good fiddle music.
Yeah. Do you think it would need to have kind of a different soundtrack, like in Europe versus America?
Maybe, or maybe like when you're in the angel's point of view, I feel like you could have more liturgical music, and then at the other times when you're with other characters, maybe it would be more modern, and then you could get some cool like modernized klezmerized liturgical music when you're mixing them together. That would be really fun.
That sounds really cool. I like that a lot. Let's see. Can you tell us anything about your upcoming potential projects?
I'm not at the stage of having anything finished yet, but I do have an idea that I pitched to my agent, and she did not tell me that it was terrible. So I'm going ahead with it. And that one takes place a little earlier and entirely in Eastern Europe. And it is a tale of betrayal and revenge, and there's a big dog in it. So hopefully I will get that to the point where it's an actual book-shaped book and be able to start pitching it sooner rather than later.
Amazing. Every story needs a dog, I think,
Yes.
or some kind of animal.
This one only has goats in it, I think.
Yeah, I like almost count like Little Ash and Uriel with they have some animal features that work a little bit. And do you have anything else coming up where people can find you, other virtual events, other interviews that folks can look for?
I'm taking a little bit of a break right now, unless anyone else wants to invite me to an event. I'm always open, but nothing is coming up immediately. I did have some fun interviews. There's an interview on Geek Girl Authority that just came out today where I talked a lot about Oriel's genderlessness and how I approached writing that. I was also on the Book of Life podcast. I did an interview with them with Heidi Rabinowitz. That should be coming out in December, probably. That was a really fun conversation. And I also have an interview that Aidan Polydoros and I did for the Jewish Book Council, where we interviewed each other about this book and his new book, Bone Weaver, which I really enjoyed. It's kind of like if the Grisha trilogy took place in a version of fantasy Russia that had more central ethnic minority characters. I think Leigh Bardugo's early work, she hadn't thought as deeply about that. And so that's something that's a little bit missing from the original Grisha trilogy. So it's really fun to see someone interpret a fantasy similar to the Grisha trilogy, but with more of that depth that the Russian Empire had.
That sounds really good. I read the Aidan Polydoros and the interview that was out today, and I thought they were both fantastic. So I definitely recommend looking those up and reading them for more fantastic insights. And let's see, we have one more, maybe one last question, which is, if you had to write in another genre, not fantasy or historical, what would you pick?
If it had to be neither, that's a little harder. Almost all of my projects that I have in mind right now are one or the other or both. I would love to do horror sometime if I can make myself do it. I'm sort of a little too squeamish, but I really like a lot of horror. There's some horror that's even kind of fun, if that makes sense as an adjective to apply to horror. But I really enjoyed recently Dead Flip by Sarah Farizan, which is about a kid who gets eaten by an evil pinball machine. And it's about like his best friends dealing with his disappearance and then his reappearance 5 years later when they've outgrown their friendship and they've moved on. And he's this 12-year-old evil ghost who got eaten by a pinball machine. And that's a really fun book. Melissa Albert's recent book, Our Crooked Hearts, about like a group of teen girls who are friends who are witches, and they get like a little too into it and some really yucky stuff happens. I really enjoy horror sometimes, but it's something that I haven't quite managed to get into the like visceral details that you need for really good horror. So that's something that I kind of think of as I develop my writing skills and stretch myself a little. That's something that I'd like to get into.
Very cool. Yeah, we just split out like horror books at the bookstore. I feel like there's definitely, I don't know, there's a lot of interesting things you can do with horror. Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot recently. I think horror and comedy are two things where you have to really know what you're doing in order for it to hit. So I read a lot of bad horror just almost to be able to see flip it around and be like, why is this bad?
Mhm.
It gives you a good insight into structure and timing and story. And so, yeah, definitely takes a lot of skill to write, and something that I would love to be able to do.
Fantastic. Well, we are just about at the end of our time. Before we wrap up, um, is there anything that you're reading now that you would like to share about?
I have just packed, I'm going on vacation, and I just packed a bunch of books to read. I have not started yet, but one of them is from Mari Lowe, with LQ, Aviva versus the Dybbuk, which is a middle grade Jewish fantasy. And it is apparently very, very good. My publicist loves it. I have been told many times that I need to read it, and I just haven't had time yet. So I'm very excited to get to that one. And also the sequel to The Golem and the Genie I have in my little box. And I have Sophia Pasternak's middle grade Blackbird Blue Road, which is also a Jewish fantasy. So I'm pretty excited that I have multiple Jewish fantasies on my to be read list too.
That's awesome. And time to sit and read.
Yes.
That
Yes.
is also exciting. Um, well, thank you so much for being here this evening. It's really, like I said, exciting to get to talk to you about this book, because I'm a huge fan of it and a huge fan of you. And I want to thank also everyone who joined us virtually for being here this evening. We really appreciate you tuning in as well. As a reminder, you can order Sacha's book at eastcitybookshop.com. We do ship if you need a copy shipped for yourself or for someone else for the holidays. And you can also check out our upcoming events at eastcitybookshop.com. Most have a virtual component. And we are so happy to have you here tonight. Thank you so much again, Sacha.
Thank you. This was great. It was a great conversation. Thank you everyone for coming on Friday night to hear me talk about a book.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.